All right, it's time to get started tonight. If you have your Bibles, Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. Thank you all for being here tonight to study the Word of God, to look at the life of Jesus once again. This will be the last class I'm subbing in for John. And so it was a pleasure to teach with you, and I'm so thankful for the opportunity. Luke 14, beginning in verse 1. It happened that when he, Jesus, went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees of the Sabbath to eat bread, they were watching him closely. And there in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they kept silent and took hold of him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well, and will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day?" And they could make no reply to this. So we're picking up on the heels of chapter 13, a chapter that dealt with Jesus and the Pharisees for a majority of it. And so this chapter is no different. Luke is just laying out there this contrast between the faith of the Jews and Jesus' teaching. And so Jesus goes to the home of one of the prominent Pharisees on the Sabbath day. And so Jesus is invited, but not only Jesus. Who else is invited to this feast, this gathering?
A man with palsy.
Yeah, a man who has an infirmity. The modern day term would be edema. Basically, it's just a swelling based or built on accumulated from fluids. That was really complicated, and that's as far as I got in the commentaries. But so you have Jesus and you have this man who were invited to this feast being put on by one of the leaders. And so, how do we see that it's a setup, right? How likely is it that Jesus will be invited to this event? What's the relationship like, just thinking back to chapter 13?
Well, they're trying to trap him.
Yeah, they do not like Jesus. And the text says they're going to watch him closely. And so that's where we get the indication that this is all a setup. So it's not very likely that Jesus would be invited to this event, but how much more likely is it that this other man gets invited? What did they view men and women with infirmities as? Sinners, right? We looked at that last class in chapter 13. The Jews had this misconception that if someone was born with an infirmity, either they sinned or who sinned? Their parents, right? And so you have that aspect, but also the aspect we talked about as worthless to society. They can contribute in no way. And so it's very unlikely that these two figures, Jesus and this man, would be invited to this event, but they are, because the Pharisees want to trap Jesus. And they probably think they have Jesus in a corner, right? What happens if Jesus heals the man? What are they going to accuse him of?
What's in the Sabbath, so they keep working on the Sabbath.
Yeah, I think there's a reason they're having this gathering on the Sabbath, right? They're going to say, Jesus, you violated the Sabbath, like they did in chapter 13. What happens if Jesus doesn't heal the man?
You don't have the power to do so.
You don't have the power? That's a good answer. What else?
You're not compassionate.
You're not compassionate. That's what I was thinking. They would make this accusation against Jesus where you talk this talk and you talk about this Samaritan and helping people and, who is your neighbor, Jesus? You talk this talk, but you're really not compassionate. You really don't care about people. So they probably think they have Jesus in a corner. But before Jesus heals or doesn't heal this man, he asks them a question. What question does Jesus ask them?
He said, lawful to heal on the Sabbath.
Exactly. It's not something profound. It's not some math equation. It's not one of those statements of Jesus where we have to dig in the commentary. Jesus or Pharisees, yes or no? Can I heal or can I not heal? And what response do they give?
Nothing.
They give no response. This is a crowd of the most prominent figures concerning the law in the land. These are people who are educated, people who devote their lives to studying the law, to preaching the law, and helping people understand the law. And Jesus asked them a very simple question about the law, and they give no response. In my notes I have, it's kind of like walking up to like Michael Jordan or Tom Brady and asking them a question like, If you ask Michael, what do you think of this traveling violation that happened the other day? And Michael just stared too blankly because he didn't want to respond. And these people are the experts in the field when it comes to the law, but they give Jesus no response. Why?
They have approached Jesus previously and asked him questions, and he's then asked them a question in response, and they didn't have a good answer, like John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Is God or man? And they said, well, if we say it this way, he's going to come at us from this angle. If we say it this way, he's going to. So it's like they've learned just to be quiet.
Yeah, they've learned their lesson in trying to confront Jesus. In chapter 13, what did it say about the Pharisees when Jesus responded to him when he healed that woman? You remember? How did Luke describe the Pharisees? It says they were humiliated by Jesus. The Pharisees knew not to mess with Jesus, and so they didn't want to respond to this question by him. They said nothing because they didn't want to agree with him, and so instead they remained silent. Because as we saw in chapter 13, there's nothing wrong with Jesus acting on the Sabbath. He had a very solid answer to them. And so Jesus heals the man, and just as he did in chapter 13, he again gives a very practical response. He says, "Which of you has a son or ox fall into a well and not immediately pull him out?" Again, he's just pointing out their hypocrisy. Obviously, they would have pulled their son or their ox out of a well. That sounds really hard to pull an ox out of a well, by the way. I don't know how you would go about that. But again, it just goes to show the point. They would work, right, to get something done. And so Jesus is pointing out their hypocrisy. Because instead of focusing on what God's law says, all they want to do is impose their traditions and impose their authority on people. So that's the first couple of verses, and that's going to set the tone, because this is not a feel-good chapter. Jesus wants to teach some very impactful and very tense lessons, as we'll see in this chapter. So let's continue reading. Verse 7. And he began speaking a parable to them. He began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they've been picking out places of honor at the table. And Jesus said to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both will come to you and say, 'Give your place to this man,' and then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who invited you comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." So Jesus is at this feast with the Pharisees and the lawyers, and what does he notice?
Pecking order.
The pecking order. What do you mean by that?
It seems like those more important have the better seats. Those less important didn't have as good of seats.
Exactly. You had these people who felt entitled because of their status, and because of that, they were seeking these places of honor at the feast. Why? And going along with that, why did they choose these seats? Why were they sitting in the places of honor? Why did they desire that seat?
So that others would see them.
That's exactly right. So that others would see them. That we see all throughout the Gospels that they have a desire for their social status to be seen by men, right? We see that with the man that Jesus tells praying, "Do not do this so that you be seen by men." Jesus again and again attacks their pride and their desire to be seen for who they are socially. Ooh, that was close. And so Jesus tells a parable based on what he sees. He talks about how you don't immediately go to the seats of honor because someone more distinguished might come. And so what happens when someone distinguished comes in this parable? What happens to the man that immediately goes to the seat of honor?
He's chastised.
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
He's kind of called on the carpet, and you go take that top seat.
Yeah.
It might be lowered.
Yeah, you can almost put yourself in the scene. You're sitting at the table just minding your own business, and suddenly at the other end of the table, the master comes and says, "Hey, buddy, you can't sit here. I have someone else coming in. You're going to go sit down there at the other end of the table." And what does that bring upon that person who has to be moved? What does the text say?
Shame.
Shame, disgrace, humiliation, embarrassment, different translations say. Because the master takes them from the seat of honor and he lowers them. And so what does Jesus tell the people to do instead in this parable?
Be humble.
Be humble. That's a great answer. And that's the point of the parable, right? To be humble. So instead of going to the places of honor, where does Jesus tell us to go? Or tell the people in this audience to go?
To take the lower seat.
Take the lower seat. Why?
Because if they are to move up, then the people who are giving the feast will ask them to move up, and then they'll be honored.
Exactly. So you have that scenario one where the master comes and he takes you and he moves you all the way to the end of the table and you feel disgrace, you feel shame. But then there's the other scenario where you're sitting down there and the master walks all the way down and he comes to you and says, hey, I want you to move up with me and I want you to sit on my side or sit with me in these places of honor. And what does that bring upon that person? Instead of shame and humiliation, there's a lot going on. Let's start over here. What was that?
Joy.
Joy?
I think it goes with the pattern of the last will be first and the first will be last.
Yeah.
So there's glory there when God picks you for that.
Yeah, exactly. There, instead of there being humiliation and shame, there's glory because you aren't, even though you aren't, well, that's the point of the parable. Even though you aren't exalted by men in this life, who's going to exalt you in the end? God will, right? And so that brings us to the application of this parable in verse 11. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus is teaching that humility is, yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking, I think the lesson also can be in the fact that 9 out of 10 times you're probably not going to be asked to move up.
Yeah.
So it's maybe those 9 out of 10 times that you're sitting there realizing that you aren't the person that's going to be in that seat and learning to live with that. And that's a hard lesson to learn, is that you're not the person that gets to sit in that seat.
Yeah, and that ties along to Don's lesson on Sunday. Not everybody's going to be Matthias, but it's what we do when we're not chosen. And that's a great point that you're making there. Back in my notes, Jesus is teaching that humility is key to being a kingdom citizen. And that goes along with what you're saying is the application that I have is what a great point we need and what a great application we need to take as we try to be kingdom citizens in the church. It can be easy to feel entitled, to feel like we need to sit in the chief seats mentally, that our opinions need to be respected more than others, that maybe because we've been a member a long time, we deserve respect, we deserve a voice at the table, but that doesn't always need to be the case, does it? We don't need to have that attitude. We don't need to let that pride swell up in us, because what happens when we become people who are prideful, according to that verse?
Be humble.
We're going to be humbled by God. But when we choose to take the lowly seats, when we're okay with others getting the honor and the glory here in this life, that's when we're going to be exalted by our God. And we're going to talk about that in 2 parables to come, when it talks about our reward in heaven, despite whatever we get here in this earth. So, any other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead and.
Yeah, the same can be held, James 2 talks about honoring the person who has much more versus the one who may not have it.
Yeah, and that goes along with a lot what Jesus is going to teach in this parable. We don't need to judge. It doesn't matter what someone has, but it matters what we do and our attitudes.
I think it speaks to the custom of the time where those who had money, who had influence, who had power, felt I can't think of the word, that they were entitled to do it. And I think it's very much today the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Those who have money and prestige and fame feel like they need that honor, so it's certainly not something that was just to that time and period.
Yeah.
Something to fight today too.
Well, and that's what's so special about Jesus, right? Because Jesus came to this earth and he deserved all of it. I mean, if anyone's going to be glorified, if anyone's going to be a celebrity and exalted, but what is Jesus described as in Philippians?
Humble servant.
Someone who was a servant, someone who humbled himself, someone who emptied himself, and we're supposed to imitate that. And we imitate that because why? Well, because one day we're going to be exalted too, just as Jesus was exalted by the Father. and now sits at his right hand. That's a great point. Anything else? Go ahead, Ethan.
One thing that we need to be careful of, I think, at least that I know I struggle with, is having the right motive in this, because I know the motive in this, sitting in that seat originally, is glory. You want earthly glory. And so when you sit in that lower seat, what does that then render you? It renders you heavenly glory. And in both of those facets, in both of those ways, the glory is about you. And so when you are being the servant and you're sitting at the end of the table, you're thinking about yourself in the long term. Yes, this person's getting the glory now, but the glory that I'm going to get in heaven is going to be so much greater about this. The glory should never really be about us at all.
Yeah.
It should always be about God. And so that's my thought, is a lot of times I find myself serving now because that's what's expected of me, that's what people like to see, and because I know that in the long run, it's going to work out so much better for me. But that's not the mindset at all of a servant of Christ or a follower of God. It's about, I'm doing this now because this is what Jesus would do, and Jesus would do this because this is the serving thing and the loving thing to others. And it's like, it's when we change our motivation from it's about me and my glory to it's really just about loving others in all things, and does this glorify God, is when I think we're really going to see results change.
Yeah, well, and that goes along to the chapter, because the next parable is all about why we're kind, why we serve. And then the last chapter is talking about how Christianity ain't glamorous. There's not a lot of glory in that, because it's all about counting the cost. You have to deny yourself, you have to give up all these things. And so we do it because we love Jesus at the end of the day. That's a good point, Ethan. And I don't have much more to add to that, because I feel like it was pretty sufficient in itself. Anything else over these couple verses? I love the discussion tonight. I love teaching on Wednesdays. I'm living on egg rolls and coffee right now with Lauren gone, and so please keep it coming, all right? Let's keep moving on in the text. Luke 12, beginning in verse 15. Luke 12, beginning in verse 15. Or excuse me, Luke 14, beginning in verse 12. And he went on to say to them, he went on to say to the one who invited him, when you give a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, otherwise they may also invite you in return. So that is your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. And you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. When one of those who were reclining at the table heard this, he said to him, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. So Jesus tells a parable, or gives a teaching. Who does he give this teaching directly to? What does the text say?
The one who invited him.
The one who invited him. So you have the leader of the Pharisees. Jesus looks at him and he lays out this teaching. But while it's said directly to him, I think we can find great application for us. So this parable begins with a rebuke. Jesus says, do not. What does Jesus tell them to not do?
Invite your rich friends.
Invite your rich friends. Who else? Relatives? Neighbors, right? Don't invite your friends, your family, your neighbors. Those who are rich, essentially, is the list. Why does Jesus tell them that?
You're inviting them basically because you want to be invited back to their place.
Yeah, Jesus says don't invite them, the text says, or otherwise they also may invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. The Pharisees had a problem, didn't they? Just like you were saying, they were inviting people so they could get an IOU. They were inviting people for self-centered and self-motivated reasons. And we need to point two things out very, very quickly about this passage. What Jesus is not teaching is that you can't be repaid for your kindness. That is not what this parable is about. If someone repays you for your act of kindness, that's okay. But what Jesus is teaching is unselfishness should be the guide to my kindness, not repayment. I should serve, I should help others because of love, because of compassion and mercy and unselfishness, to be like Christ, because that's what Christ demands. But my motivation cannot be pride, and it cannot be because I get something out of it. That's what Jesus is teaching here. It's that same mentality you might have had in high school or junior high, and you invite that friend to your birthday party, or you invite them to sleep over, whatever it might be, so because they have a lake house, and you want to go, you want to ride the jet skis, right? We've all been there in different ways in our life. We have these friends because we want that IOU that they have. We want them to give us something in return. And the Pharisees were no different. The reason they were inviting people was so that they could get something from it. But Jesus tells them who they should invite instead. Who does Jesus tell them to invite?
Poor, the cripple.
The poor, the cripple. Who else? Is there more?
The poor.
Lame and blind.
Lame and blind.
The poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Could these people offer anything? No. These people have nothing to give, but Jesus says invite them. And why? And why does Jesus tell them that?
Because that's what goes into your heavenly purse.
Yeah, that's treasure in heaven right there. Life is not about what you can get here in the now. But Jesus is teaching that we should be focused on heavenly things, on spiritual things, on helping and being compassionate as He is, because one day our Father will reward us. And what this chapter is all about is we lose something here in this life. All the chapters talk about, or all the sections of this chapter talk about that, especially the ones when we're counting the cost. We lose something here in the physical as Christians. In this case, we lose that IOU. We lose social status, but what we gain is unimaginable. What we gain is heavenly. I'm reminded of Galatians chapter 6, and you know this passage, but in Galatians chapter 6, do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Do not let us lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. Then while we have an opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those in the household of faith. Paul's saying the same thing Jesus is. Don't grow weary in doing good here and now. Why? Because God is not mocked. God sees us. God knows what we are doing, and one day we will reap what we sow in eternity. Yes, go ahead.
Carson, Jesus is making a point here. I believe that feeding the wealthy is a worldly reward, but feeding the poor is for heaven reward. And as he told us in Matthew 6, that we're to store up for ourselves treasures in heaven. There's not a thing wrong with storing up for ourselves treasures in heaven. That's what we should do because Jesus said to do it. So that's what we want to do, store up for ourselves treasures in heaven, not on this earth.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And obviously there has to be a balance there of motivation, right? But again, Jesus commands us, hey, don't worry about the here and now and building up treasures, but focus on eternity. And going along with that, and we talked about last class, bearing fruit. This is an aspect of bearing fruit, helping those who are helpless and giving them a meal, right? Any other comments?
You know, Carson, part of this probably is that Jesus ate meals with rich people. You know, Matthew, the tax collector, it said, was very rich. And he invited Jesus to dinner with all of his tax collector friends. So he was in the middle of a bunch of rich folks. Mm-hmm. But he also had dinner with two disciples on the road to Emmaus, where they probably split some bread. Maybe something simple like that. Mm-hmm. Part of this is that he was comfortable and at ease and more than willing to spend time with both groups, depending on what they needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Anything else? All right, well, let's keep moving on. Verse 15, I almost forgot. This statement by the man. He says, Jesus has finished this parable, and then he says, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. We're going to talk about why he might have said that, but let's first establish what commentators think. Commentators debate over what exactly this means. There's two possibilities. One, this man thought Jesus was and God was going to establish an earthly kingdom for the Jews, and he was going to eat with them at the table, disciples would. And the second possibility is this man is referring to heaven, to a spiritual place where he could be at the table of God, sustained by him. But regardless of whatever he meant by this, it provokes a response by Jesus, as we'll see in a second. But I can imagine what this man was probably thinking. This man wants to break the tension in the room. Could you imagine having a feast, having a party, and Jesus just comes in and he's laying it on them. He's taken this party, this event that they were supposed to have fun at, to enjoy each other's company, and he's telling them. He's telling them about their motives, about what they're doing wrong. He's laying this teaching on them. So this man probably thinks, what's something non-controversial I can say, just to settle the mood here, like talking about the weather at Thanksgiving when it turns to politics. Like, this man just wants to break the tension. So he says, I already thinks I got it. Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. What can be controversial about that? I can't wait to do that. Well, Jesus responds to this man, because the very next verse says, but Jesus said to him. Think about this man. He said this just trying to help out, and Jesus looks at him and he begins this paragraph of teaching. And let's read those verses together. Verse 16. But Jesus said to this man, a man was giving a big dinner, and he invited many. And at this dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first one said to him, I have bought a piece of land and I need to go out and look at it. Please consider me excused. Another one said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and are going to try them out. Please consider me excused. Another one said, I have married a wife. For this reason I cannot come. And the slave came back and reported to the master. Then the head of the household became angry and said to his slave, go out at once into the streets and lanes of the city and bring here the poor and crippled and blind and lame. And the slave said, Master, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room. And the master said to the slave, go out into the highways and along the hedges, and compel them to come in, so my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner. So Jesus tells a parable. Out of all the teachings Jesus has given us, this is the one that is the truest parable, a parable in which we need to identify some of the pieces, and we'll do that in just a moment. But it's really interesting how Jesus is teaching here. He almost takes the first 2 literal parables, talking about their situation, and now he gives a spiritual one, taking a feast, talking about the invite list, talking about those who come and accept the invitation, but now he's going to turn it into a spiritual conversation with the man. And so let's walk through the story. A man is having a feast, and he sends out invitations through his servant. And so let's put ourselves into the story for just a minute. And when I wrote the material, he wasn't supposed to be here, so just bear with me. Let's put ourselves in the story. What would your reaction be if you heard a knock on the door at about 5 o'clock, and there I am, and I say, Jonathan Bannon is inviting you to dinner tonight. Get ready. What do we see? Dinner at his place tonight. Everything is ready. Be ready to leave in 10 minutes. And what would your reaction be if I knocked on your door and said that?
Sure, I'm in.
Yeah, sure, right? That was my, yeah, I'd love some dinner.
We're of the same kind, though, so there's a difference.
Yeah. No, that's a good answer, sure. Yeah, I'd love to. What else?
Do you have the authority to invite? Sorry. You asked questions.
I did. What else?
Do you have his permission?
What else?
Wait a minute, I gotta get ready, I gotta take a
Yeah,
shower.
I gotta take a shower, I gotta get ready, I'll be ready in a second, right?
Can my kids come?
Yeah, can my kids come? You start making demands. Can my kids come to this event, right? What else?
What's on the menu?
What's on the menu? You want to know what's going to be on the menu? This is going to be worth my time. It's been a long day at work. I am not there for a casserole, right? You want the gourmet meal. What else?
I want to know who is cooking.
Who is cooking, right? Definitely not JB. I don't want that.
I'm making eggs.
Right? what I see in all these answers is a sure, right? That'd be good. That'd be an okay time. Like I'd love to do that. I'd love to hang out with them, you know. But maybe we make some demands. Maybe we want to make sure it's worth our time. But now let's change this a little bit. What if Bill Gates sent his secretary and he knocked on your house and he said, "Hey, I want you at dinner tonight. Can you be ready in 10 minutes? I want to eat a personal meal with you." Or Elon Musk, he sends his secretary and he says, "Hey, I want to eat a personal meal with you, Mr. Kelly." Or your favorite actor or actress or sports celebrity, they send their person and they say, "Hey, I want you to enjoy this once-in-a-lifetime thing with me, and I want you to come free of charge at my dime." What's our reaction then?
What's your agenda?
What's your agenda? That maybe is a fair question, right? Absolutely.
I would go in a hurry because Elon Musk grew up in my hometown.
No way. That's pretty cool. Yeah, but I like the word hurry, right? What else? Would we drop everything? Would this be? Would we tell the secretary, "Hey, you know, what's on the menu tonight? I'm a little tired. You know, only the best." No, we wouldn't say that, would we? If we were invited to one of these once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and man, we'd be hitting the 10-minute drill, wouldn't we? We would do everything we can to get ready, to get on the road, and get there because of who the invitation is coming from and how special the invitation is. And so let's jump back into the story. You guys really like JB, by the way. I thought my job security was going to go up a little bit tonight. So let's put ourselves back in the story. This is how they should have responded. It should have been like an invitation from Bill Gates or Elon Musk where they drop everything and they're ready to go because this is the man in the town. This is the prominent man with the biggest house and the biggest wallet. He is the boss, right? Everyone wants to eat with him, but only a select few can. But is that what we see? Is that how they respond to the invitation? They begin to make excuses. What are the 3 excuses they make? Number 1.
Some land, gotta go see it.
I bought some land, I need to go see it. What was number 2?
Have some oxen that need to be tested.
Bought some oxen, I need to go try them out, right? And what's the last one?
Married.
I got married and I can't come. So those are the 3 excuses they make. And so the slave goes back to the master and he tells them about this. And what's the master's emotional response? He's angry. He's angry that they've rejected the invitation. So what does the master do?
Extends the invitation to those that Christ had already talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, he sends the invitation to those who are the most opposite of himself. Those who are furthest away from his home, those who are furthest away from him economically and socially, the complete opposite, the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And so the slave goes and he delivers the message and they receive it and they come. And there's so many come, but yet there's still room. And so the master will send the servant out once again to fill the house. And the master concludes by saying, "For I tell you, none of those who were invited shall taste my dinner." And so what's this parable all about? What does it mean? Let's put the pieces together. So who's the master? Who's the man? Who's the king, as Matthew's gospel puts it? Christ. Well, I think Christ will be the messenger, right? The person sent. So who's going to be the man? God. God, the Father. And who are the invitees? We talked about them in chapter 14, chapter 13. The Pharisees and the Jews, right? The religious elite, those who viewed themselves more significant, and who chose those seats of honor, right? And so who's the lame, the poor, and the blind?
That's us.
The Gentiles and us, people who want to be exalted by the Master, people who wouldn't have received the invitation unless he extended it further, right? And that's us. And so we have the parable, we have the people in the parable. And so there's 2 great applications for us. The first has to do with the invitation. And we've already hit on this, but we need to ask ourselves, this is something for you all to reflect on, for you all to take home. But we need to ask ourselves, how do we view the Master's invitation in our own lives? I think that's a great question to ask ourselves. And I know the case is for me, and I can imagine for all of you at some time or another, maybe the invitation becomes dull. After those first couple of years of being a Christian and understanding God's grace and God's mercy and how you have been invited into His church and promised a home with Him, to be with Him, how amazing and awesome that is after years and years of attending a church, of being a Christian, maybe that's become a little dull. And maybe you look at it like a JV invitation and you say, well, that's nice. I look forward to that. But it's not something special. It's not something esteemed in your mind. It's not something that moves you to action. And that's nothing against Him. I'm sorry. So how do we view the Master's invitation? What do we see it as? Do we rejoice over it? Are we thankful each and every day that God has given us this invitation, despite us being the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, the people that don't deserve to be in His presence, the people who deserve death instead of mercy and grace? Are we thankful for that invitation? And so that's one application that I saw from this. But the other applications have to do with the excuses. And so let's modernize this parable for just a minute. What would be the modern translation of "I bought land and I must see it"? What excuse is that? What do you think? And there's no one right answer.
I have to work.
I have to work. I need to get to work, and I'm sorry I don't have time for this. That's good.
I've got my future planned, and I need to see how it works out.
I have my future plan. I've made these investments in my life. I have everything going for me, and I need to focus on that. That's good. What else? And the first two may be very similar, so don't worry. What I had for the first one is an incorrect view of necessity. And this goes along with work and your plan for life. One translation says, "I bought land and I must see it." Right? That word "must." Did this man already see his land before he bought it? Yeah, like you don't buy land without seeing it first. It doesn't make sense. And so he has an incorrect view of necessity. He thinks this is important. He thinks that this is something he needs to do. And because of that, he rejects the Master's invitation. What could we view as necessity that in reality is not? We already hit work, but there's some necessity to that.
Have to clean the house.
Yeah.
Have to mow the grass.
Yeah, and maybe we prioritize that over spiritual things, right? Man, we get off work, and instead of coming Wednesday night, man, things are backed up at the home. We got dishes, we got the lawn to mow, and so we look at those things and we say, hey, this is important. And because of that, I'll put that spiritual stuff on the side burner. What else?
Recreation that you've invested in.
Recreation. I had sports as a big one on my list. I remember being in high school, and there'd be so many kids who they themselves and their parents would encourage them, hey, you don't need to go to service. You need to be at the basketball game, right? You don't, or maybe even homework, maybe even school. You don't need to worry about studying your Bible because you need to study for this test that's going on, right? Is there anything else? Those are pretty much the big ones I had.
I think it's the old saying, it's going to be there when you get back.
Yeah.
That land wasn't going anywhere.
The land was not going anywhere. It wasn't necessary for him to see it then and there. And that really points out the Jews, because this is all about the Jews. They were so focused on their agenda, on their tradition, and because of that, they missed out on the invitation. What would be the modern day equivalent of, I bought an ox and I need to try it out?
I bought some chickens and I need to go collect the eggs.
Not many people can make that excuse. That's a good one. I mean, what you're saying is true. It's work. I got work to do, right? And it's an inability to value kingdom things over our careers, over our work, over school, whatever it might be, over recreations. I saw this in a commentary that this excuse is a parallel to workaholism. An inability to put the pen down, to leave the office because work is the #1 priority. My life is centered on doing this, on getting ahead of the game, right? And as Simon said, it's going to be there when you get back. You can take a break, but this is an inability to put aside work because our focus is not on heavenly things, but our focus is on earthly. And so what is the parallel to I just married a wife in modern day terms?
Family obligations.
Family obligations? Yeah, I think it's pretty sufficient. Any relationship that we prioritize over kingdom citizenship, maybe it's in our family, maybe it's a friendship, whatever it might be that pulls us away from the kingdom, right? Anything that we prioritize over Jesus and our relationship with Him and over the Master's invitation could be an excuse we make. Anything else? Go ahead.
Carson, I just wanted to add in verse 21, where Jesus talks about bringing in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. It reminds me so much of the passage in Luke 4:18, where he went to the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth and said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he appointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, sent me to proclaim and release the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are downtrodden." It's passages like that that just make us fall in love with Jesus Christ. And those are some of my favorite passages.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I agree. And the bell just rang, folks, so we got some ground to trod. Let's keep reading. Verse 25. Now large crowds were going along with Jesus, and he turned and he said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first consider or calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This man began to build a tower but was not able to finish.' Or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one against him, or with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So then, none of you can be my disciples who does not give up all his own possessions." Jesus sees this crowd, so we're going to walk through this passage very quickly, and so I apologize if I miss some of your comments. But Jesus sees this crowd behind him, and he notices their hearts. And what Jesus shows in this scenario is that Jesus' primary concern is not the number of people that follow him, not to diminish that, but what his primary concern is their hearts and their devotion to him. And so he's going to give them 4 conditions of discipleship. The first is this: you have to love Jesus more than earthly relationships. What does Jesus say? You have to hate father, mother, sibling, brother, sister. And what we learn from the other Gospels is that what Jesus is saying, that word literally means love less. You must love those people less than you love me. And if you're taking notes, Genesis 29 is a great place where we see that. We see that with Rachel and Leah. Jacob, it says, hates Leah and loves Rachel. Did Jacob actually hate Leah? No. But did he love her as much as Rachel? No. That's what that means, love less. Jesus is saying we can't love our relationship here on this earth more than we love him. And so that means that his opinion, his commands outweigh everyone else. And then Jesus says we have to love him more than self. He says, yes, even yes, you must hate your own life. If one who does not hate his own life cannot be my disciple. The cost of being a disciple is that we no longer get what we want. It's no longer about our desires. We may want a particular job. We may wish to engage in immorality. We may get angry and not want to forgive. But what Jesus is saying, you may want those things, but you have to love me more than you love yourself and your own desires. And then he says in verse 27, we have to bear our own cross. We have to bear our own cross. Meaning that we have to bear whatever comes with Christianity. That may be persecution. That could be your reputation is hurt. That could be strife between you and some of your family members because you love them less than you love Jesus. But we have to take up our cross and follow him daily. And lastly, we have to love Jesus more than our own possessions. Jesus ends that section by saying, so then none of you can be my disciples who do not give up his own possessions. What Jesus is saying is you cannot serve 2 masters. And we have 1 minute left and there's 1 section left. Therefore, salt is good. But even if salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or the manure pile. It is to be thrown out. He who has ears, let him hear. Very simply, what this verse is talking about is salt is good, just as a disciple is good for the kingdom. We are useful as salt was useful. We can help as salt helps. We can enhance as it does the flavor that it came in contact with, as we can enhance the world by living and teaching the way Jesus has commanded us to do so. Jesus is saying, though, if we're not useful for the kingdom, if we are not all in disciples, if we don't count the cost and go all in to this, then we're going to be useless. Those who turn away from Jesus, they're of no good for anything. He who has ears, let him hear. Thank you guys so much. I'm glad we got through it.